Okay, and I'm Ann Erkowicz, Member Engagement Manager at Save the Sound. Again, welcome today. Today we have Judith Enck with us. She's the president of Beyond Plastics. She's an environmental policy expert. Judith began as an environmental advocate and has held top influential positions in state and federal government. Appointed by President Obama, Judith served as the regional administrator of the US EPA. Judith is a professor at Bennington College, where she teaches a class on plastic pollution, which is open to the community and to audit. You can audit the class through Zoom for 7 weeks in September and October. We're going to share the registration link in the chat at the end of the presentation, and we'll also share all the links in a follow-up email after today. Save the Sound advocates for protections of Long Island Sound's regions, land, air, and water in Connecticut and New York. Judith is a valued advocacy partner of Save the Sounds in Albany to advocate for bills that would prohibit the use of PFAS from a range of everyday household items and on the Packaging Reduction and Recycling Infrastructure Act. With that, I'll pass it over to Judith. Thank you so much for joining us today. Take it away.
Thanks, Anne, and thanks you all for joining. I mean, you must be very hardcore to be on a Zoom webinar on a beautiful day when you could be out on the water. So it's my great pleasure to be here with Save the Sound. I appreciate Save the Sound's work across the board, but particularly in helping us pass a really important plastic packaging reduction bill in Albany that passed the Senate in June, and now we just have to come together and get it through the assembly. Microplastics in big waters of body like Long Island Sound is a hot issue. There was a great article in Newsday just a few days ago that documented this growing concern about microplastics in Long Island Sound. Let me see if I can get my PowerPoint up. Great. So as mentioned, I am with Beyond Plastics, a nonprofit based at Bennington College. We do nationwide work. Follow us at beyondplastics.org. Next slide. As mentioned, I had the privilege of being appointed by President Obama to serve as EPA Region 2 Regional Administrator. It was a great experience, but when you're appointed to your job by the president, your last day is his or her last day. So I had a lot of time to think about what to do next. And while I totally loved visiting Superfund sites in New Jersey, as illustrated in this picture, I really wanted to tackle the plastic pollution problem and felt like being an outside advocate was the most effective way to do that. Next slide. So take a look at this cartoon, see if you get it. This is the last funny thing I'm going to say during this presentation. Not everyone gets this. I do want to start by saying, though, there are alternatives to plastic. So I'm going to talk to you about the problems with plastic, but you know what the alternatives are. It's things like paper, cardboard, metal, glass. They can be made from recycled material and they are recyclable. Next slide. So we don't need, while I love mycelium packaging and bamboo, we don't have to wait for the next big breakthrough. It's here. The fundamental problem, though, is that we consume too much natural resources and create a lot of waste. Click again, please, Colin. Click again. Click one more time. So I'm not going to read these numbers to you, but 4% of the world's population, we generate 12% of the world's solid waste. This is not sustainable. And the United States is number 2 in the world in terms of single-use waste generated. Next slide. Plastic production is surging. Next slide. And it's just getting worse with every passing year. Next slide, please. Worldwide, we are generating a lot of plastics, but large amounts of plastic are getting into the ocean every year. And it's not from ships illegally dumping out in the water. Most of the plastic in the ocean originates from the land. So you can be walking down the street in a community, a plastic bag gets away from you, it goes into the storm drain, goes into a river, and then into the ocean. Next slide. And scientists estimate that unless we change the status quo, by 2050, there will be more plastic in the ocean than fish. Next slide. This is a huge issue for sea life, including seabirds. That's an albatross. That is not an outlier. Scientists come across this regularly. The seabirds mistake plastic in the ocean. If it's orange or red, they think it's food. Next slide. And microplastics is a huge problem. Next slide. Microplastics are 5 millimeters or less. Colin, next slide, please. That's what they look like. And scientists are now even able to look at nanoplastics, which is even smaller. One of the major reasons I decided to work full-time on plastics is because of the environmental justice impacts. Most plastics are manufactured in Louisiana, Texas. There's a stretch of the Mississippi River in Louisiana that's actually called Cancer Alley because the cancer rates are so high from the petrochemical facilities. And then also manufactured in environmental justice communities in Appalachia, New Jersey, Tennessee, etc. Next slide. Plastics are made from fossil fuels that are derived from gas and chemicals. Next. And historically, plastics were made from chemicals and oil. Today, almost all plastic is made from chemicals, 16,000 chemicals, and ethane, which is a byproduct of hydrofracking. The reason we are seeing so much plastic in stores and in our communities, it's not because you and I are voting for more plastic, it's because fracked gas is cheap and the industry has captured a waste material from fracking and they use it to make plastic. Next. This is not to scale, but this is a visual of a hydrofracked site. And you can see the aquifer, the groundwater is very vulnerable. Next. And this is a picture of a hydrofracking site in Colorado. And EPA is in the process of finalizing regulations that would not allow for this type of flaring, but the flaring is widespread now at any hydrofrack site that you might visit. Closest to us is Pennsylvania. Next. So this is the big move now. Oil companies that you've heard of, Shell, the little mom and pop company, ExxonMobil, are investing in these facilities called ethane crackers. They take the waste gas from hydrofracking sites, they heat it to a really high temperature, and the material cracks, thus the odd name, an ethane cracker. Next slide. And that whole process is very, very polluting. Next slide. This is from the Shell cracker in Beaver County, Pennsylvania. You can see these permitted emissions. Next slide. And all of that is to produce this. It has a funny name, nurdles, but there's nothing funny about it. These ethane cracker facilities produce billions of little white and different color pellets, plastic pellets called nurdles. And it is a major problem for so many rivers. They're not only during train derailments, but just in general operating. You see so many nurdles in the environment. You probably can't see this, but this is a box of nurdles collected not far from where I live in upstate New York, because there was a train derailment a few months ago, and millions of nurdles were released into the Hoosic River. And they're so tiny that once they get out in the environment, it's very hard to recover them. Next slide. So why are we seeing this surge in plastic production? Well, plastics is the plan B for the fossil fuel industry. Historically, we used fossil fuels to generate electricity at power plants or for transportation, cars, trucks. Those were the two major uses of fossil fuels and the two major sources of greenhouse gases. However, you know what's going on with electricity generation. Slowly, we see improvements in energy efficiency. My heat pump is far more efficient than another heat source I might use. And the growth of renewables like solar, wind, geothermal. So demand for fossil fuel on the electricity generating side is down. And on the transportation side, we're seeing more and more electric vehicles, electric cars, trucks. So demand is down. Next slide. So plastics is plan B for the fossil fuel industry. That is what's going on in the plastics sector. Next slide. A couple of years ago, Beyond Plastics decided to take one of the first looks at greenhouse gas emissions from plastics. We named our report The New Coal because coal plants are slowly closing, but the greenhouse gas emissions from plastics is increasing, and we're practically canceling out the gains we've made from closing coal-fired power plants. Next slide. So our report found that plastics is responsible for the annual greenhouse gas emissions as about 116 coal-fired power plants. That is not good. Next slide. And a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions are from ethane crackers, and more are proposed. Most of these will not be built, but some of them will be. And again, canceling out the benefits of reducing greenhouse gases. And look where these are: Kentucky, Louisiana, Ohio, Texas. Texas is ground zero. And if you want to do a deeper dive, look at oilandgaswatch.org. Next slide. One of the community partners we're honored to work with is Sharon Levine from St. James Parish, Louisiana. Sharon is a retired special ed teacher. She now spends full time trying to protect her community from petrochemical expansion, including 2 ethane crackers proposed by the Formosa Plastics Company out of Taiwan. Next slide. And the struggle that Sharon and her neighbors are going through is because of this. This is like from every American supermarket. It's as if we can no longer cut up our own fruit and vegetables. And we're paying a high price for this, quote, inconvenience. Next. We're also eating and drinking microplastics and nanoplastics. There's a real concern that some of the chemical additives used in plastic packaging will leach directly into food and beverages. And hopefully you all know, never put your food in plastic in the microwave, never ever. But when you think about heat, think about a hot day like today and all the food that's transported in hot trucks. You're going to get some leaching, and the toxic chemicals hitchhike onto the microplastics. Next. Plastic particles have been found in seafood and also some plant-based alternatives to seafood. You want to avoid oysters, shrimp, I'm very sorry, mussels, because that's where the microplastics will concentrate. Hopefully this is not what you're planning for dinner tonight. Next slide. And there's been just a tremendous breakthrough on the science side. New technology has allowed environmental researchers to now count nanoplastics, not just microplastics. And this is a study from Columbia and Rutgers. They looked at 1 liter of a plastic water bottle and found 240,000 detectable plastic fragments in that 1 liter of water. I do everything possible to avoid drinking from bottled water made from plastic bottles. And this is also a concern with soda and juice. If you drink orange juice in the morning out of a plastic bottle, for instance, if you're on the road, don't shake the bottle because you're going to liberate some of the microplastics even further. Next slide. So this is having a health impact, and it's affecting healthcare costs. Dr. Leo Trisandi and other noted health researchers did an analysis and looked at the impact on healthcare. It's an article in the Journal of the Endocrine Society. Next. And I want to just talk a moment about how plastics are being found all over our bodies. There's peer-reviewed scientific data showing plastic in our blood. Next. In human lungs. Next. This is a particularly concern, if you could go back, this concern is in the New England Journal of Medicine, just published a few months ago. Microplastics and nanoplastics were found in the 2 arteries in our necks leading to our hearts. Basically, the microplastics and nanoplastics attached to plaque. And this article, this research, showed a specific increased risk of stroke, heart attack, and premature death from plastics in heart arteries. Next slide. Microplastics have been found in human breast milk. Next slide. And also the human placenta, both the maternal side and the fetal side. And this is significant because the fetus is hanging out for 8 or 9 months only, and the placenta already there's microplastics identified in the human placenta. Next slide. And this is kind of interesting. Very recent study identifying microplastics in human testicles and canine testicles. And the testicle study is getting so much more national media attention than the breast milk and the placenta study. Why could that be? And we shared this study with state lawmakers in Albany as we were marching toward passing the Packaging Reduction Act in the Senate. And the legislative interest was much more significant in this study. Next slide. So you're probably sitting there thinking, okay, but we can at least recycle plastics. Isn't that the solution? And this is when I feel like I'm telling people there is no Santa Claus. Keep recycling your metal, paper, glass, cardboard, compost your yard waste and food waste if possible. Most importantly, look for ways to reduce waste, relying on refill and reuse. But plastic recycling has been an abysmal failure. It always has been, it always will be. In the United States, only 5 to 6% of plastics get recycled. Next slide. And the reason is because there are many different plastic colors, many different plastic resins, and thousands of different chemicals. So if you have an aluminum can, you can confidently know that that'll be recycled into a new aluminum can. Think about your own house. If you have a bright orange hard plastic detergent bottle near your washing machine and a clear plastic squeezable ketchup bottle in your refrigerator, those 2 bottles cannot be recycled together because the process requires that you have a homogeneous waste stream, all aluminum or all newspaper or all cardboard. Plastic recycling doesn't work. Next slide. And the people who know this the most is the plastics industry. They have known this for decades. And yet outfits like the American Chemistry Council and Plastic Industry Association have been saying for years the answer to the plastic problem is recycling. And they know we will never have a very high recycling rate. And you may have noticed, next slide, lots of national advertising promoting plastic recycling, and they know that it's not going to work. Knowing it's not going to work, the industry has now shifted to something called chemical recycling, which is even worse. We published a report with our friends at IPEN last October on chemical recycling. This is on our website. What is chemical recycling? The industry calls it advanced recycling. It's not advanced. It's not really recycling. It's taking waste plastic and heating it to a very high temperature and creating a very small amount of fossil fuel, the last thing we need. That's what most of these facilities are. And then there are one or two that are really trying to turn waste plastic into new plastic polymers. And a big problem with that is it creates a huge amount of hazardous waste. We issued this report just in October, and we profiled 11 operating facilities in the United States. Since October, 2 have closed. There's only 9. Next slide. And it is an expensive process. It only exists when there's huge taxpayer subsidy. Next slide. And we don't want more fossil fuels. We don't want more hazardous waste. And these facilities are almost always cited in environmental justice communities. And then here's the ringer on the next slide. It's not, so these are where the facilities are operating. 2 of the 11 are now closed. Next slide. Here's the takeaway. It's only handling 1.3% of plastic waste generated. So if you accept the magical thinking that these are not polluting facilities, they're not burdening environmental justice communities, they're not super expensive, let's just go along with this thought exercise. They're only handling 1.3% of plastic waste. So let's say they double the number of facilities. They're at 2.6%. Let's triple. They're still under 10%. So it's not a solution, but it gives the plastics industry something to say when a policymaker says, I'm really concerned about plastic pollution and the fact that recycling of plastics doesn't work. What are we going to do? So this is more of a marketing technique than an actual solution. Next. So the American Chemistry Council is lobbying really hard to promote this as the solution. They actually succeeded in getting 26 states to reclassify chemical recycling as manufacturing and not waste management. So that means less regulation of the emissions and more opportunities of taxpayer funding. There's a bill in Albany to do this. Senator Mannion and Assemblymember Hindman. I'm sure there's a bill in Connecticut. We will work hard to block these bills in both states. Next. There is a proposed international plastics treaty not going well. The final meeting is supposed to be this December in South Korea. There's a whole bunch of nations called the High Ambition Coalition that are trying to get a really comprehensive good treaty adopted. The United States is not part of the High Ambition Coalition. The United States is the very definition of low ambition in these treaty negotiations. Next slide. So what are we going to do? The solution is pretty obvious. Stop making so much plastic. Next. So there are alternatives. Early on, I said there's paper, metal, glass, but what we're really interested is in true source reduction and then products that don't rely on single-use plastics. So this is not an endorsement of a particular company, but there are companies out there like Blue Land. You can get products that are in reusable glass packaging. I have it in my bathroom. I'm not going to run and get it. And when the product is done, you just get a little tablet and you add your own water and you can avoid the packaging over and over again. Redish is a very cool company in New York City. They service big corporate cafeterias. They pick up your dirty dishes and return clean dishes. It's kind of, if anyone remembers diaper services. And then separate from products, I urge you to just kind of look at your own home. We drink a lot of orange juice in our house, even though I constantly tell my husband there's too much sugar in it. So I just refuse to buy plastic orange juice containers or even the Gable containers. So some of you may not know there's something called concentrate. You can, in the freezer section, you can get frozen concentrate, and then you just use a reusable glass pitcher over and over again. Next slide. We have a bunch of model bills on our website, bills that would stop the purposeful, the intentional release of balloons. The governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, just signed a bill prohibiting the intentional release of balloons in Florida. We should be able to do that in Connecticut and New York. Next slide. But here is the big push, and what I really am excited to talk to you about. We are pushing hard to get a packaging reduction and recycling bill adopted at the state level. It used to be called Extended Producer Responsibility, EPR. The New York bill is called the Packaging Reduction and Recycling Act. It requires a 30% reduction in all plastic packaging over 12 years. It gets the most toxic chemicals out of packaging, so it bans all PFAS in packaging. It bans vinyl chloride, lead, mercury, cadmium, formaldehyde. Who wants that stuff in your packaging? It does not allow for chemical recycling to count as real recycling, and it puts a modest fee on all packaging. It's called an eco-modulated fee. So if your company has refillable packaging, you don't pay a fee. But if your company is selling multi-material plastic packaging that's impossible to recycle, you pay a higher fee. And that money goes to local governments to fund municipal recycling and waste reduction programs. We all know municipal recycling. We could use, say, electric recycling trucks. We could use more bins, but also waste reduction. How about giving money to all of our schools to install dishwashing equipment so kids can be served on real durable dishes rather than single-use disposable plastics? How about public water fountains in every park, in every bus station, in every train station, and city streets? You walk down a few streets in Massachusetts and there are water fountains, so you don't have to buy plastic water. So the good news is we have two champions on the bill. Senator Pete Harckham, some of you may have him as your state senator. You're very lucky. He succeeded in passing the most comprehensive packaging reduction bill in the country. He passed it in June, in early June, in the state Senate. And now we've shifted over to the Assembly to try to pass the bill in the Assembly. If there is a special session, we expect the bill to come up for a vote. If not, we do this all over again in January. So I want to urge you to please write to your Assembly members, Assembly Bill 5322D, urge them to vote yes and work to get it passed. And there's lots of good information on our website. If Pete Harckham is your senator, thank him for his hard work and his true leadership on the bill. Next. Another bill pending in Albany is to expand New York's bottle bill. Currently, there's deposits on soda, beer, bottled water, but not on things like iced tea and wine and liquor. So there's a bill proposed by Assemblymember Glick, Senator Rachel May, to expand the bottle bill and to increase the deposit to 10 cents. Unfortunately, that did not pass because of fierce industry opposition. We know that Connecticut already updated its bottle bill, so thank you for that. Next. And then we have to make sure that there's no legislation promoting chemical recycling. Next. There's a federal bill. It's a heavy lift, but if you want to pay attention to federal stuff, the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act is terrific. The bill numbers are right there. Next. And we have to pay attention to the climate crisis. You know, the evidence is all around us that this is not a good time in terms of climate change, and plastics is a big part of the climate crisis. Next slide, please. Climate change doesn't cause hurricanes, but it makes hurricanes much more intense. So if the ocean temperature or the Caribbean Sea temperature is warmer, you can have a Category 2 hurricane become a Category 4 hurricane with immense human suffering that goes along with it. Next slide. More and more wildfires because the forest is drier than usual because of the heat. Next slide. This was last summer. Remember the Canadian wildfires affecting air quality in our whole region? Next slide. And again, just like we have solutions to alternatives to plastic, we have alternatives to burning fossil fuel. Let's roll on solar and wind. Recently, it's been reported that New York State is not going to achieve its goal of 70% renewables. Next slide. So, sorry I zipped through that. I wanted to leave enough time for questions, but we are a resource for you. We're only 5 years old. We're in all-day kindergarten at Beyond Plastics, but we're slowly growing. Our staff went from 1, me, to now we have 14 amazing people working nationwide. On this Zoom is my colleague, Kathy Jenkins, who is our development director. Feel free to give us like an enormous donation. First, donate to Save the Sound, and then donate to Beyond Plastics. Follow us on social media. I'm embarrassed to say we're still on Twitter, but there's important stuff still happening on Twitter. And for some reason, I'm getting all of these Taylor Swift tweets that totally suck me in. You've heard of her. So follow us on social. And next slide. If you zoned out during my talk today, Google John Oliver and plastics. John Oliver had an amazing segment 2 years ago. It's as if he took my class. He did a tremendous presentation on production, use, and disposal of plastics. Actually, my speechwriter when I worked at the EPA is now at John Oliver's show. So I suspect he may have had something to do with that. But John Oliver presents it in a far more comprehensive and funnier way than I do. So gather the family around and watch the John Oliver segment on plastics. And now I think we can open the floor to questions. Thank you, Colin. Sorry to subject you to that.
No worries.
Thank you so much, Judith. Before we jump into questions, I want to share a little bit about our Connecticut cleanup program. As you heard, plastics are present in our streams, marshes, parks, beaches. Large pieces of plastic suffocate marine life. Small ones carry toxins that accumulate in the fish that we consume. And all of that poses a severe threat to the ecosystem health. Cleanups are an important part of addressing that because the environmental benefits are numerous, from making sure litter doesn't enter the water, to preventing discarded fishing lines from entangling wildlife, to the removal of items that can leach chemicals into the ground and waterways. Save the Sound has hosted the Connecticut cleanup as part of Ocean Conservancy's International Coastal Cleanup for over 20 years. In 2023, Save the Sound helped coordinate 75 cleanups with almost 1,800 volunteers and close to 70,000 items picked up, over 7,500 pounds of trash on 131 miles cleaned. The data from these cleanups, the type of trash, the number of pieces, the total weight, and more is used to advocate for policy change like Judith was talking about. So it's important information while you're doing good. We have cleanups throughout the year, but the large majority of our cleanups happen in the fall, in the month of September particularly. But again, we do offer cleanups throughout the year, so you can learn more about becoming a cleanup captain. Or keep your eye on our events page to become a volunteer and participate in one of the cleanups. And again, we'll share links in the chat here, but we will send a follow-up email to everyone who registered with some information covered today and links that Judith mentioned and links that I just mentioned now. So thank you all for being here. And with that, I'll open it up to questions.
Maybe one way to do the questions is, yes, like Ellen, you can just wave and I'll call on you. Or if you know how to use the raise hand feature, you just go to reactions on the bottom and hit wave hand. But why don't we go to Ellen and then Ella?
Let me unmute. Judith, thank you so much. That was truly frightening, but helpful. I'm a member of the Rotary Club of Branford, Connecticut, and I'm hoping that as a team, we can get involved in some of the cleanups. But I also just returned from the Rotary International Convention in Singapore, and there was a booth that I visited called End Plastic Soup. And I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but it's an initiative started by the Rotary Club of Amsterdam. And I'll see if I can put the information on it in the chat, but they're trying to get a special action group and they had a lot of visitors to their booth. And this is a global thing that it would be nice if some of us could take part of. They have newsletters, but you know, that kind of raised our awareness. And I'm hoping as a Rotary Club on the Sound that we can play an active role. And so thank you.
Yeah, that's great, Ellen. We do hear a lot from Rotary clubs. One of our active members was over in Singapore. And Rotary is just an amazing community resource. I applaud the cleanups. When I lived in Brooklyn, when I served at the EPA, I would go out in front of our small apartment building every weekend and pick up trash. And it just kept coming every Saturday. It just keeps coming. And so our real focus is on systemic change. And what I mean by that is passing laws and new regulations to reduce the production of plastic, because we can't, we can't recycle the vast majority of it. So we really welcome the credible voice of Rotary in some of these policy discussions as well, because we're up against some formidable odds. When I started Beyond Plastics, some of my friends, before I did it, I went around and I did a bunch of meetings with people to see if there was an unmet need here. And 5 years ago, there was. And some of my friends who knew what I was scheming said, Judith, you've worked so hard for so long. You've got some really nice job offers. Do you really need to take on plastics? Because you're going to be taking on the fossil fuel industry, the chemical industry, the plastics industry. And I'm like, well, I know, but I still have a lot of spunk left in me, and we have to solve the problem. And so to do that, we need a lot of hands. We can't just walk the halls of state legislative bodies with good facts. We need grassroots supporters behind us. So we actually started local groups and affiliates at Beyond Plastics, where if you're with an existing group like Save the Sound, you can become, hint, hint, a Beyond Plastics affiliate and get access to all of our information and organizing skills. Or if you live in an area where there's not an existing local group, you can organize a local Beyond Plastics group. We just require 3 people or more to come together. We provide great training. So we are very slowly trying to build that grassroots movement from the bottom up, We really need Save the Sound. We really need Rotary. We need civic society involved in this. And it's the only way we're going to counter the strong special interest opposition in the halls of our state legislatures and certainly Congress. So lots of information on local groups and affiliates also on our website. And I feel like we've got a window. We don't have a whole lot more time. Once more ethylene crackers are built, we're in real trouble. But we have a window now, and we have public attention on this issue, and we've got to keep going. Ash, and then Dana.
Hi. Yes, thank you so much for spreading this knowledge. So much of what I hear about like suggestions of what an individual can do to improve this problem is about individual consumption. But I'm interested in if you could recommend a single high impact action that we as individuals on this call could take like today or tomorrow, that would, like, what is the one thing that like we should just do when we get off this call?
Vote and volunteer on a campaign. We are nonpartisan, so I'm not going to put my finger on the scale, but the action we need is more people involved in the political process to elect strong people. That might not be the answer you were looking for. And then in terms of as a consumer, you have to look at your own practices. So, take a stroll through your house or your business and see what the heaviest plastic use is. So for instance, not to get too personal, but we don't use a lot of ketchup in our house. So I don't have to sweat it over the ketchup container. Although you can find glass ketchup bottles, by the way, you have to hunt for them. But as I mentioned, we use a lot of juice. So try to substitute for the plastic use of juice. I would also really concentrate on food and beverage packaging, because you do not want to be consuming a lot of microplastics in your food or your drink. And definitely do not put any plastics in the microwave. If you are someone who gets a cup of coffee every morning at a local coffee shop every day, bring your own mug. So just, there's this great book, 50 Simple Things You Can Do to Save the Earth. It's very old, but it still holds up. And there's some plastic suggestions in here, but use concentrates for soaps and things like that, although not those little pods, because they have PBA plastic in them. So it's a deeply personal question, Ash. It depends on what your plastic usage is. I hope that's helpful. Dana, and then Ella.
Thank you. And I would just add, but I have a question. One of them is, don't use a nylon tea bags. You may think you're being healthy drinking herbal teas or green teas, but often they come in those nylon tea bags. Those are horrid for microplastics in your tea.
Yeah.
You're adding hot water directly to those. I don't know how those are even legally allowed.
Yeah.
And that gets to my question. I agree with you, grassroots efforts, going out and cleaning up plastic, but I think we have got to get industry on board. We need public demand. How can we create where industry, right now, I'm just going to give you an example. Right now, there's this PFA certified plastic, and I think that's probably greenwashing. And because there's all kinds of polyfluoro other chemicals that aren't under the label of PFAs that are in these, and they can create new chemicals that aren't even EPA regulated. So how do we, I think the public is still very, very greenwash, very ignorant of this. How can we get companies to how do we create that public demand? How do we get companies to now start spouting that their products don't use plastic? I buy coffee that comes in those packages that are paper. Often they do have a foil lining, but I try and buy, every product, not I'm kind of on this wave, and once you get started trying to buy things that aren't plastic and reuse containers so you aren't buying more plastic, you use them for appropriate things. How do we get industry on board to be, or is this going to just be another greenwashing tactic like PFA certified plastic to get them on board to say, "No, we're not using a plastic container.
Yeah.
Buy our product." And I think Bronner's does that. Bronner's
Yeah.
soaps and stuff. Okay, so I'm
Yeah,
dropping.
so a couple things. Greenwashing is a big problem. Greenwashing is lingo for deceptive advertising on environmental claims. And Beyond Plastics is actually releasing a major report this Thursday on so-called compostable or bio-based plastics. Look for that. And our call to action is to get the FTC to be stronger on regulating deceptive environmental claims in commerce. But to your broader issue, Dana, no matter how hard you try, it is virtually impossible to avoid buying a large amount of plastics in your supermarket. It's a little easier in a food co-op, but there's still a lot of plastic there. So my conclusion is the only way companies are going to change is if we have laws to require the change. We know how to do this. Look at car companies. They were not going to improve fuel efficiency standards for cars until the Clean Air Act was adopted and EPA put out strong regulations. And now, a new car you buy today, even if it's not an electric vehicle or hybrid electric, you're getting a whole lot more fuel efficiency in your car than you were 10 years ago. Same thing with appliances. A refrigerator you buy today is far more efficient than even 5 years ago. That happens because laws are passed and agencies enforce the laws.
But those laws don't get passed until there's demand. And we've got to create, that's where I'm going, is how do we get that demand? And I would say one thing, besides just not using plastic yourself, I have gone to my work cafeteria. I've got them to use less plastic. I've gone to my gym that has this smoothie bar. They now use less plastic. If we start creating that demand, each of us individually, and it's hard, you got to have the nerve to go up to the manager and say, listen, this is really disturbing. I'm not buying your products here because of this. And, you can expand that saying that I've got friends that I'm going to tell the same thing to. If we can help create that demand, laws don't get passed until that demand is there.
I applaud you for doing that. I don't know if it's going to scale up quick enough to really substantially change things. And we are in a plastic pollution crisis. So I'm not saying don't do it. Keep doing that. But I don't know if companies are going to change on their own, even if they see that their customers want to see a significant amount of change. But thank you for what you're doing. I certainly appreciate that and hope more people do it. Ella?
Hi. So I know you touched today on how plastic recycling is not super effective, like at all. But I've heard you talk in the past that about how there's also health concerns about plastics that have been put through processing and made into new recycled goods. So I wondered if you could touch on that a little bit, and also, should we even be recycling plastic? Like, is it too risky health-wise, or should we just chuck it out?
Oh, gosh, that is such a hard question. And there have been a couple media reports lately, like why even bother? So yeah, I recommend, for instance, in your kitchen, I recommend you get rid of all of your plastic utensils, spatulas and forks and big spoons, because they're good chance they're made from recycled electronic waste. And look, it pained me. I went through all my drawers in the kitchen. I couldn't believe how many of that stuff I had. And a couple of years ago, I just tossed it and replaced it with metal and wood. There are serious concerns if you're using recycled plastic for food and beverage and for what you're drinking from right now. So you have to you have to kind of, this comes up a lot. Do we want to be using reusables, and should the reusables be made from plastic? So a growing concern. And then on your broader question, should we even bother? I do recycle number 1 and number 2 plastics. So you can look at the bottom of the container and you'll see a tiny, tiny little number. The one plastic recycling piece that does work is plastic soda bottles in bottle bill states like Connecticut and New York, because the material is kept source separated. But I never recycle anything above number 1 or number 2. And if your community says, for instance, they do take number 5, I'm very suspicious that a lot of that is sent to other countries, creating challenges there. So what you could do if your community, for instance, foolishly says, put all your plastics in the bin 1 through 7, ask them where it's going. And they're likely going to say they give it to a waste broker, and they don't know what the waste broker does with it. But we're having a debate within Beyond Plastics on what we should be recommending in terms of anything besides number 1 and number 2. So our position is evolving. Right now, we're at keep doing number 1 and number 2, but nothing beyond that. Ash?
What are your thoughts on the movement to turn plastic into thread, put it in our clothing?
Well, 70% of our clothing has plastic in it, and any plastic in your clothing is a problem if you ever want to wash it. So I mentioned earlier, Tracy Tully, a really outstanding environmental reporter with Newsday, just did a piece on microplastics in Long Island Sound, and she talked to scientists, and they're really pinpointing microplastics from fibers. So when you wash your clothes, and also when you put it in the dryer, you're going to get some microplastic releases either into a public water supply or your septic tank. And then you have a concern about the microplastics in the sewage sludge. So it's very unrealistic to say we should all wear, linen and wool. But the Newsday article had some really helpful tips, like front loader washing machines are better than top loaders because it's not as aggressive, and try to use cold water, which is good for energy use anyway. And if you can hang your clothes rather than putting it in the dryer, because believe it or not, all the plastic in our clothing is a source of microplastics from whenever you wash your clothing. There are a couple products, one called a Cora ball, where you can throw it in the washing machine and it collects some of the microfibers. It collects about 30% of them. There's also something called a guppy bag. But I think adding even recycled thread to clothing is not a good idea. Let's end on something positive. Anyone?
I was going to interject that Save the Sound, although I know people receive a lot of email, we do send out action alerts with links to make it very easy to contact your legislators on issues like these. So please keep an eye, just check your inbox, look for those emails, and we will let you know when there's bills, that affect voting on plastic coming up in Connecticut and New York, and we will make it really easy for you, provide language that you can tailor. It'll link directly to your legislators, and the more of you who advocate for these bills, as Judith mentioned, putting those laws in place, is a great step in solutioning this problem.
Thank you, Anne. Amanda, final words?
Yeah, I actually noticed that there's a question that came in via direct message on the chat. So this is from Celia. How promising is the plant-based or bioplastic alternative PHAs and PHBs? I know you mentioned that really briefly.
Yeah, I'm not really sure. We're, you know, we've been waiting for the bio-based breakthrough for a couple decades. It's not there yet, but you know, it's something worth keeping your eye on. So I know you're all registered to vote. Go find your niece or your nephew or your neighbor and get them registered. Across the board on climate change, on plastics, on wetlands preservation, on water quality, on acid rain, a lot's at stake in this November election. And if someone says it doesn't matter, just kind of slap them in the head and tell them it does matter. We need environmental voters. That's the most important thing we can do in the next few months. And support Save the Sound and support Beyond Plastics. There's a lot to do. Go hang out on our website. It's really interesting and fun, and you'll get some ideas. Thanks.
All right. Thank you again, Judith, for being here, and thank you all for joining us. And we will follow up with an email. Thanks so much.